George here. Today we're going to talk about natural law theory. They have a very different way of talking about what is a law and what isn't a law, and also the relationship between morals and laws. The two thinkers we're going to talk about today are St. Thomas Aquinas, who's a medieval philosopher, and also Martin Luther King Jr., who's a civil rights activist from the 60s, whose brilliant Letter from Birmingham Jail is a brilliant exposition on the ideas underlying natural law theory. First, we're going to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas and how his formulation of natural law theory works. What's nice about this is that he starts with a definition. Like a lot of good philosophers like to start with a definition. What is he going to define? Law. What is a law, according to Thomas Aquinas? A law is a rule and measure that induces a person to act or restrains a person from acting. Thus, it's easy to understand how this is connected with, at least at first, with positivist theory, right? Because it's easy to understand that sovereigns make laws. Sovereigns make laws that either induce a person to act or restrain a person from acting. However, St. Thomas Aquinas borrows from Aristotle to explicate that even further, right? And so from the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, he says, the purpose of life is happiness. So, the purpose of legal matters is to preserve happiness for society. That seems to flow very reasonably from these definitions, right? Therefore, a law should be something that works towards the common good of society, of course. How do we do that? Well, just use reason. And that is natural law, according to Aquinas. According to Aquinas, that's natural law. Use reason to expand a general happiness and common happiness across society. And use reason to create rules and measures that either induce people to act in a way that encourages happiness in society, or use reason to determine rules and measures to restrain people from acting in ways that decrease happiness in society. So the first precept of law then is that good is to be promoted and evil is to be avoided, right? And there already, by that point, we see, I hope, the connection, the inherent connection between morality and law. Laws are to promote the goodness in society, right? And the goodness of human life. Laws are to avoid evil. And this takes us to an even further argument or further conclusion for the natural law theorists, including Thomas Aquinas, which is there can be just laws or unjust laws. Well, how can you tell the difference between a just law from an unjust law? Well, again, use the definitions that we've been going with here, both from Aristotle and from Thomas Aquinas. We use reason, so laws have to be reasonable. If a law is not reasonable, it's going to be unjust. And it has to preserve happiness for society. If a law preserves happiness in society using reason, it's a just law. If a law does not preserve happiness in society, it's an unjust law. Or if a law is unreasonable, it's an unjust law. What does that mean? Unjust laws are not laws at all, according to St. Thomas Aquinas. Unjust laws are not laws at all. Anything that departs from the natural law is not law, but rather a perversion of laws. What does that mean? Of course, different societies have different sort of structures and things, so it's okay for different societies to have different laws and different structures, because different societies will use reason to come to different sorts of conclusions. As long, however, as they use reason to preserve goodness in society, they will be just laws that follow the natural law. And perhaps another society uses reason and the preservation of goodness in society to create different kinds of laws. And I think that's okay. For example, in America, right, reason has been used to create a tripartite government where there is the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and the executive branch. In England, or rather in the United Kingdom, legislative branch and the executive branch are actually part of the same thing in a parliamentary system, right? The executive branch, the prime minister is ultimately a member of the legislative branch, right? And that's going to be a very different system. However, they're both using reason to get to a different place because different societies can be structured differently. And that's fine. They both, therefore, adhere to the natural law system. However, let's take some other nation that has a dictator and quashes people who have haircuts that aren't approved, right? Does that preserve the goodness of society? I think that somebody like Thomas Aquinas would say that the government of North Korea violates the natural law, and therefore those laws are not good laws. They're not, number one, they're not just, and thus they're not real laws at all. They're perversions of laws in North Korea, and that's why people can only get a very select number of haircuts, among other sorts of problems in North Korea, of course, too, yes. So, how might unjust laws come to be? Well, there's two ways that they could be unjust. Number one, they might be contrary to the human good. I suggested also they could be against the notions of reason or illogical. And Aquinas says they are opposed to the divine good. Now, George's note for a second. This seems to me the most controversial part of natural law theory because people see that this is connected to something divine. And of course, anybody who doesn't believe in Catholicism the same way as St. Thomas Aquinas does will probably not agree with that. However, I think that if we step back for a second and just see every other part minus the divine aspect, we can still appreciate the notion of natural law, right? We can still appreciate this notion of natural law that Thomas Aquinas and, in a moment, we'll discuss Martin Luther King, suggest. Martin Luther King, we'll see, refers to God's law a lot. However, for both Martin Luther King and Thomas Aquinas, they're going to argue that reason, right, reason, the capacity to think properly and logically, are and do reveal this divine law. Now, for those of us who are atheists, we might just stop right there, right? And reason will give us natural law, right? And we don't have to go full stop or become baptized in their faith, right? We can still subscribe to some version of natural law theory that merely focuses on the notions of reason to give us these natural laws and determine between just laws and unjust laws. For example, I think that an atheist can understand that the laws under Nazi Germany were unjust. An atheist can also come to a conclusion that certain laws in North Korea today are unjust. Why? Because they're going to use some sort of appealing to natural law theory, such that, wait a second, let's just use reason, and reason will see, and reason combined with this notion of the common good, and that when we see that both in Nazi Germany and contemporary North Korea, we see that one, reason isn't valued, and two, the common good isn't valued, then we see this notion that, wait a second, they're violating the natural law. They're violating just laws. Whatever laws they do have in North Korea are unjust laws. Certain laws especially, right? Maybe not every law, but certain laws are going to be called unjust laws. And so I think that we can appreciate the value and the ideas behind natural law theory without, again, becoming baptized in their very specific religions. Yes. And so to expand some of the ideas and build upon the ideas of St. Thomas Aquinas, we're going to examine a little bit further Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. He starts his letter by saying, listen, I was invited here because I wanted to engage in non-violent direct action, protests ultimately, right? And why must he engage in this non-violent direct action? Because there is injustice in 1960s Birmingham. And by the way, there might be cries for injustice even today in the 21st century, right? Even beyond Birmingham. And how do we speak to that? Well, Martin Luther King Jr. gives us a layout in his letter. He suggests injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that's why Martin Luther King feels inspired to fight against this injustice. Because if there is injustice in Birmingham, there is injustice all over America. Whatever affects one affects all indirectly. And what he says is this white power and this white supremacy that does exist leaves people like him with no other alternative. He must participate in nonviolent direct action. He must fight against this injustice because there is no other alternative. He suggests that freedom is never given by an oppressor. You can never walk up to the oppressor and say, please give us freedom. Rather, you must fight for it. You must take it back. By the way, this is going to be an argument that I think holds a lot of water even in the 21st century and probably even before then too, right? We can't always just depend on an oppressor giving you your freedom. If you are subjugated, we have to fight for that. You have to fight for the freedom because it's not going to be given to you. And what Martin Luther King says is because he's fighting against injustice, that makes everything that he's doing legitimate. He is fighting for justice. Well, how can this be justified? He suggests and echoes the Augustinian notion that Aquinas gave us that an unjust law is no law at all. And so, what are just laws? Well, Martin Luther King uses much more religious language than we discussed in St. Thomas Aquinas. And Martin Luther King says that just laws are laws that are in accordance with God's will, or the law of God. Well, what was the law of God, at least according to Thomas Aquinas? Reason, using reason to discover structures that will lead to the common good and happiness of mankind, since that is man's purpose, to be happy, according to Aristotle, right? And so Martin Luther King is expanding upon that and saying, yeah, or echoing really the same sort of principles there. Of course, unjust laws are laws that are out of harmony with such moral, reasonable, happy inducing laws, or happy creating laws rather, right? Unjust laws degrade human beings. All of segregation is unjust laws. Why? Because they violate and damage the human soul, the human personality, the human being. And so it is just for people to disobey unjust laws. Why? Because they're morally wrong. And since they are morally wrong, these unjust laws, they're actually no law at all. Therefore, I can disobey such a law. Because this wasn't a law at all. And that's what gives Martin Luther King Jr. and his compatriots the passion and the justification to violate such unjust laws. Another factor that plays into such laws being unjust is that unjust laws are imposed upon a minority who have no say in creation of their laws. So underlying that notion, Martin Luther King is suggesting, it sounds like, that democracy And a very important part of democracy is part of just laws and part of natural law theory, that all people shall have a say in the law that I must live under, that I'm forced to live under, right? And so that's one more little piece that Martin Luther King Jr. adds to this natural law theory, that it sounds like if he says unjust laws are those that are imposed upon a minority who had no say, it sounds like he's saying democracy is natural law theory, right? Democracy insofar, I don't mean majoritarian democracy, of course. What I mean is just democracy that all people have a voice, right? There's a lot of different flavors of democracy. Take a political philosophy class, and we can see that there's all sorts of flavors of democracy. Well, I've already discussed how American-style democracy is very different from British-style democracy. They've got a parliamentary system. America's got a three-part government system. So that's going to be very interesting too, right? And also a federalist system. America's federalist system is very different from a British parliamentary system, right? However, all that said, whenever Martin Luther King does break the law, he says he has to break it in a loving manner. Because at root, when you do break unjust laws, you are still beholden to the law, the natural law. And therefore, when you do break the unjust law of man in favor of the natural law, you have to do it with respect to this natural law, and therefore with some sort of loving manner. Whatever that means. For Martin Luther King, that did mean nonviolent direct action, protests, amongst other things. Martin Luther King reminds us, after all, that in Nazi Germany, those laws were legal. How can positivists respond to this? They can't. Unless they want to be heartless, and HLA Hart didn't want to be heartless, if we recall. But it seems to many people that, yes, those laws were in place, but I have no problem. The natural law theorists have no problem saying that those are unjust laws, and they had to be broken. Martin Luther King also responds to his detractors who suggest things like, yeah, but your protest, your nonviolent direct action, it's violating law and order, right? Look at what you're doing. You're causing all kinds of disorder. Martin Luther King Jr. responds in a couple of ways. The first, or rather, to me, the most prominent is, I'm not the one who created disorder. It's these people who created unjust laws who created the disorder. And I'm responding to the unjust law. Furthermore, law and order are supposed to be in place to establish justice. And if there is an unjust law, it doesn't establish justice. It's not the kind of order that anybody cares about, that anybody should care about. And that's why Martin Luther King Jr. has no problem violating unjust laws, despite the fact that people speak out against him. Oh, you're being a little bit too loud, a little bit too rowdy, a little bit too disorderly. Well, how else are you supposed to respond to an unjust law? And furthermore, it's not Martin Luther King Jr. who was disorderly. It's the people who created the unjust laws who were disorderly. The injustice, of course, in the 1960s in Birmingham, Alabama, was the violence and the treatment of blacks in the segregated South. Now, I don't want to talk too much about current events in the year 2021. Here we are in the 21st century. But can we use some of these arguments, and do we hear some of these arguments re-emerging in the year 2021? No, it seems so to me, yeah. And it shows the strength and the value that many people have, this intuitive feeling that many people have for something like natural law, right? Just use reason, and use reason to understand the goodness and what promotes goodness in society, and that will give us natural law. And for more religious-oriented people, well, that also coincides with the natural law that God has given us, because God, of course, is reasonable and is good. But again, I do want to echo what I said earlier, that I don't think you have to be as much of a believer. I think you can be an atheist and believe in some interesting version of natural law, right? I don't know. Or can you? What do you all think? Um, yeah, I think that's a good question to ask. Can an atheist subscribe to natural law theory? I happen to think so, as long as you believe in reason and goodness, that there's something out there, something else out there. But this does remind me back of Austin's formidable question, which is, isn't there a difference between saying this is a law and saying, is this a good law? Martin Luther King and Thomas Aquinas seem to say, no, there is no difference. Austin and Hart want to say, yeah, there is a difference between those two questions. Are these two different questions? Natural law theorists say, no, they're inherently a very related question and ultimately the same question. Yeah, how do you feel about that? I wonder, now that we've got this, that we've got a better understanding, we could wrestle with these kinds of questions a little bit better perhaps, yeah? See you next time. Bye-bye.